All right, so today we're really going to dig into some heavy stuff. The reality of democracy in Nigeria.
Okay.
We're looking at this article from the Way Out Media, and it's called Nigeria's Democratic Deficit, an examination of the failures of democratic governance in Nigeria.
Right.
And it's a lot. It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is. And it's one of those things where, we often hear about these issues, but this article really digs deep. It gets into the nitty-gritty of how these failures in governance actually play out.
It does, and it gives some really specific examples. Like one of the things they talk about is how citizens are getting harassed for driving private cars that just resemble public transportation.
Oh, wow.
Like just because their car looks like a bus or something.
It's a good illustration of how, when corruption is so deeply rooted, it leads to these really absurd situations.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's not even about the cars themselves, right?
Right.
It's about power, who has it, and how they choose to wield it.
Exactly, yeah. And the article also doesn't shy away from, the hard numbers here. Apparently less than a third of Nigerians now believe that their government is effectively fighting corruption.
Wow.
Which is down from over half just a few years ago. So it's a pretty, significant drop.
Yeah, that's a huge red flag, right?
Yeah.
That really speaks to this growing sense of disillusionment and distrust.
Okay. So you keep using this phrase, democratic deficit.
Right.
And, we've said that Nigeria has been officially democratic since 1960, but obviously something's not working. So, where does it all start to fall apart?
Well, they point to several factors.
Yeah.
One of the big ones is leadership, right?
Yeah.
They argue that there's a real problem with leaders who are more focused on, holding on to power than they are on actually serving their constituents.
Right. It's like they forget who they're actually working for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this, of course, feeds directly into the second major issue that the article highlights, which is the rampant corruption. And again, it's not just a few bad apples, right? This is systemic, deeply ingrained in almost every aspect of society. We see it in healthcare, law enforcement, public services across the board.
And we've already seen how that plays out, even with the example of the private cars.
Right.
But they also talk about, this 2023 report that found that healthcare professionals and public utility officers had the highest rates of bribery.
It's heartbreaking because it means that people are forced to resort to bribes.
Right.
To access the most basic necessities, healthcare, essential services. I mean, it's a vicious cycle,
right?
Because the corruption undermines trust.
Right.
And then that lack of trust just breeds more corruption.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle.
Exactly. And it's reflected in some of these statistics they cite. Did you know that 30% of citizens admitted to paying bribes to healthcare workers?
Wow.
Just to get service. And it's not just, one-off situations, right? This culture, it really does impact every aspect of life for everyday people in Nigeria.
Right. And there's something I really appreciated about this article.
Yeah.
It doesn't just stay theoretical. It brings it down to earth.
Yeah.
Shows how this democratic deficit isn't just some abstract concept. People are actually living it.
Yeah, for sure. And the economy is a prime example. The article talks about these skyrocketing fuel prices, these constant shortages, and they link it directly back to mismanagement and, of course, corruption within the government.
Right. And I think, it's easy to just kind of skim over those kinds of headlines when it's not your daily reality. But imagine, trying to get to work every day, put food on the table, run a business even.
Right.
When you've got these insane fuel costs and you can't even be sure if you can even get fuel.
Exactly. And everything gets more expensive because of it.
Yeah.
Transportation costs go up, food prices go up. It's a domino effect.
It's a trickle-down effect.
Yeah. And who's left holding the bag?
Right. It's always the everyday people.
Every single time.
Yeah. The article also spends some time on the 2023 presidential elections, right? And how that really became a case study almost in this whole problem of the democratic deficit.
Right, because you would hope, right, that a national election would be this opportunity for the people to make their voices heard.
Yeah.
To kind of course correct if they need to.
Right.
But instead, it seems like the election just made a lot of the existing problems even worse.
Yeah, it really highlighted the problem.
Exactly. The article talks about all this voter intimidation, election rigging, even violence.
Yeah.
All these things designed to silence people, to prevent them from having a real say.
Right. It's it really makes you question, even in a country that's been, technically democratic for decades.
Yeah.
How fragile those rights actually are.
Exactly. And it feeds into that sense of hopelessness when people just don't believe that the system can actually deliver. They lose faith.
They get cynical.
Right.
And ultimately nothing changes. But that said, the article does point to some signs of hope.
Okay, good, because I was wondering when we were going to get to that.
Yeah. Yeah, they highlight, the resilience of the Nigerian people.
Okay.
Especially the younger generation.
Yeah, I was really curious about that reading this. Like, how are young people engaging with all of this?
They are not apathetic, I'll tell you that.
Okay.
The article talks about this really interesting and growing movement of citizen engagement.
Okay.
With young people at the forefront.
Got it.
Using social media, organizing peaceful protests, really trying to hold their leaders accountable.
It is really inspiring to see that, level of passion and engagement, especially, I mean, given everything that we've just been talking about.
Yeah.
But also, I don't know, it feels like such a big task. Like, how do you harness that energy and actually turn it into, real change, systemic change? Like, where do you even begin with that? Yeah, it's a huge challenge for sure. And the article makes it clear, there's no easy solution here, no quick fix. But they do highlight, I think, a few really important areas where progress could be made. And one of the big ones is this idea of strengthening institutions.
Right.
Particularly those that are supposed to act as checks and balances on power.
Right, so things like an independent judiciary,
Oh.
A truly impartial electoral commission, the things that are supposed to keep everything in check.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, the article points out that often these institutions, I mean, they exist on paper, but they're hampered by a lack of resources.
Right.
And even more concerning, interference from people in power.
Right, so it's not enough to just have them.
Right.
They have to actually be able to function.
You need teeth.
Yeah. They need teeth. They need to be able to actually hold people accountable.
Exactly. No matter who they are.
Exactly. And that's where, this whole thing about citizen engagement becomes even more crucial, right?
Because the more people are demanding transparency, the harder it is to operate in the shadows.
Right.
Right. So the article really stresses the importance of that grassroots pressure.
So it's about kind of empowering citizens to not just be passive observers in this.
Right.
But to actually be participants.
Yeah.
But even then, how do you make sure those voices are actually translated into action?
Well, they talk about the role of, peaceful protest, which obviously has been really powerful in terms of raising awareness.
Right.
But also, supporting those organizations that are working on the ground, promoting good governance, fighting corruption, advocating for electoral reform, all of that.
So it's about channeling that energy, that frustration that's out there.
Right.
Into focused action. It's a long game. I mean, it sounds like even the article, they're cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I think cautiously optimistic is a good way to put it. It's not all doom and gloom, but it's definitely, it's a journey, it's a process.
Yeah, and I guess it makes you think about, the role of the international community too, right? I mean, this article is really focused on what's happening within Nigeria. But can or even should outside pressure or support play a role here?
That's a really interesting question, and it's a big one, right? I mean, we live in such an interconnected world that what happens in one place inevitably has ripple effects elsewhere.
Right.
So I think it raises all sorts of questions about, sovereignty and intervention, but also about what it means to be a global citizen.
Right. And what our responsibilities are.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a deep dive for another day, maybe.
Definitely.
But I think for now, at least, understanding, really getting a grasp on the complexities of this democratic deficit, that's a good first step.
Absolutely. Because you know what they say, knowledge is power.
Right.
And the more we understand these issues, the better equipped we are to actually have meaningful conversations about them, to maybe even contribute to solutions in whatever way we can.
That's it for this deep dive into the reality of Nigeria's democracy. We talked about some pretty heavy stuff, the deep-rooted causes of this democratic deficit, the very real impact it's having on the lives of Nigerians every single day. But we also talked about hope, that glimmer of hope, the fact that people are not apathetic, they're engaged, they're fighting for a better future for their country. And that's something worth paying attention to.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
But, by staying informed, by having these conversations, by supporting the folks who are on the ground doing the work, we can all play a part in creating a more just and a more democratic world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's a wrap on this one. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.